Vacation destination list. For this part, we're going to be building the HTML and CSS for this vacation destination wish list app. For lack of a better word, we'll call it an app. It's not really an application in that it's not really that sophisticated. There's no database involved or anything like that, but we'll call it an app for lack of a better term, if you want to think of it differently. And basically what we'll do here is we'll have a form, and you can add a place that you want to go visit or see in the form, and it will add it to your wish list with the picture and everything. So that's pretty cool and pretty fun. But before we get there, we need to build up the HTML and CSS. And in previous projects, I've given you the HTML and CSS done. But with JavaScript, because it's such a relationship between JavaScript, the HTML, and the CSS, the three of them together, working together to create your interface, it's important to see how the HTML comes together for this project. It's not super complicated, but it's definitely more complex than the previous projects we've done, the distance converter projects and those kinds of things. So this is a really great capstone for the end of the first course, which will really bring together everything that you've learned in this course so far. And again, we've got 3 more courses to go after this, so you'll become an expert with JavaScript if you keep going. But let's start here. Okay. The user is going to add some information to the page here, and including a URL for a picture. But if no URL for a picture is provided, it will put a generic image in there for them. And if we go over and look at the files that we've got, the start files that you're going to start with, you'll notice that we have some images in here, and I have a signpost JPEG that's going to be used as a default image there. If an image is not provided by the user when they add their item to the list. Other than that, the page is fairly simple. We've got a link to the normalized CSS script, which all that does is make sure that different browsers render pretty much the same way. It sort of normalizes the differences between different browsers in the way they render things so that you don't end up with a different looking page in a different browser. Usually it's just minor things like different spacing and stuff like that. But that can be frustrating if you're a designer and you want it to look a certain way and it changes up. Plus we have linked a style sheet, which is currently empty. And we'll be adding some styles in there. And then on the body of our page, we have linked a JavaScript file, which is also empty. And in part 2, we'll actually be building the JavaScript for this project. So that's where we are. Let's see where we need to go first to get this thing started. The first thing we need to do is add a header element, which will open and close. And inside the header element, I'm going to add an H1 heading and a paragraph. And I'm going to paste them in here, but you're going to have to type these. So the H1, vacation destinations wish list, that's going to be our main H1 for the page. Should have your web pages should have a main heading, if at all possible, that Google will search and index and that kind of stuff. And then I've got a follow-up paragraph. Found exciting places to visit on your next vacation. Fix my English there. Places to visit on your next vacation. Use the form below to add them to your wish list. Probably should put a period at the end of that paragraph too. So there we go. So we've got kind of a place to start here and a little bit of language to get us going. Once you have that done, after the header, add a main element. And inside the main element, we're going to add a form, which is going to open and close. And then inside the form, we're going to add a button, which is going to open and close. The form needs an ID. And the ID that I'm going to use, and you can use something different if you want, but because this one's a little bit long, but but it's kind of descriptive for me. So I'm going to use this ID. Destination underscore details form. No spaces. Destination details form. And then the button is going to get a type attribute. Type equals quote submit. There we go. And then we need to add some text to the button, which is going to be add to list, something like that. Add to wish list, something like that. That can be the text that shows up on the button here. Okay, great. We'll stop here and we will pick this up in the next video. Next, we'll add two fields. One is going to hold the name of the destination, and the other is going to hold the location of the destination. So each of these fields needs a label element, destination name, and that takes a for attribute, for name. And that for attribute connects to the ID of the input that goes with it. Input type equals text, ID equals name. And then also we want to make sure that users use this, so I'm just going to put required. Now, your browser has to support this for this to actually work, but rather than build in some form validation, which we're going to do in the next course, we'll talk more about form validation, but here we'll just use the built-in browser form validation, which isn't perfect, but it'll help. Okay, so now we've got a field here that is required, that has an ID that's going to match the for attribute, and it's type text. Okay, great. And then we're going to need another one, label for location. Location, maybe I'll do destination location, something like that. And then of course we need the input for that. Input type equals text, ID equals location, and required, just like before. There we go. So we've got those two fields in place. And from there we can add, we're going to add a couple more fields, I think. Yes, we want two more fields. One for the photo. So I'm going to have a label for photo. And this one is going to be an input type equals URL, because we're going to paste in a URL here for a photo that's already online rather than upload a photo or anything like that. That would be much more complicated. But we can just very easily find a photo online of where we want to put it and put that in there. And the ID is going to be set to photo. And this one is not going to be required because we can have a default photo in case we need it. And then the last one we need, label for description. We'll have a, location or destination description. And this is going to be a text area. like so. It needs to have an ID set to description to match the for attribute. And there we go. Our form is basically built. The only thing that would be kind of nice is if we had some placeholder text in these fields. So we can add a placeholder attribute and set this one to provide a name for the destination. Down here we'll do a placeholder. Where is this destination located? For the photo, we can do one there as well. Provide a URL for a photo. And for the description, what is, or maybe describe the destination. That gives us a few things to look for, a few directions for our user, which is helpful. Okay, great. So we've got that. We can save that, and we're ready to add the element that's going to take the results we put in there. That will be an article. After the form, add an article, and then we're going to add an H2 with an ID set to title. And initially, this H2 is going to have a value set to enter destination details. So that's giving us some instructions there. And then after that, we're going to have just a div that's going to be a container for this thing. And it's going to get an ID. Destinations container, like so. And this div is really going to have in it, the content generated by JS. So that's going to get the content that JavaScript is going to actually generate is going to go inside this container. And I believe that pretty much finishes the HTML that we need for now. That'll pretty much finish us off for all the HTML we need. Save the file. And then let's just go take a quick look at it over here. If I refresh this, you'll see it doesn't look like much. It doesn't look very good. We don't have any styling in here yet. So we'll do the styling next. We have the HTML in place, and now we're ready to start styling the page and making it look a little bit better. We have the normalize script up at the top of the page, which will help smooth out the differences between different browsers. But beyond that, personally, I find it helpful to zero out some margins and padding on some elements and then add them back the way I want them in order to get them to work. So I have here a few reset CSS things that I think are kind of helpful in general. And this is just my own personal preference. You could leave these out if you wanted to, but generally I think they help with sort of zeroing out some of the base styles that most browsers display by default. So I'm going to go ahead and add these in. And over here, I'm going to add on my style sheet here a rule for H1. H2, H3, H4, UL, LI, and paragraphs. I don't know what's going on with that. There we go. Oh, I'm putting this on the script page. Styles. H1, H2, H3, H4, UL, LI, and paragraphs. Margin, 0, padding, 0. That just kind of gets rid of the margin and padding on those elements. It's also helpful to say IMG, max width, 100%. I think that's kind of helpful to make sure images don't bust out of their containers. If you if you put an image in for a URL that's too big to fit in the container, it'll overflow it. We don't want that to happen. So we'll set that as well. And then I also have over here just some styles for the body. I'm going to set the font to Arial. Arial is the font that most computers have, so that'll work pretty well. And I'm going to set the color to a dark gray, the color of text to a dark gray in this basic rule here. So let's just add that really quickly as well. So I'm going to have body, font dash family, Arial, and color, #333. And already you'll see that the page is starting to come together a little bit with some of that styling. There we go. Notice that we've lost a bunch of the margin and padding on those things. Okay, great. Next, we're going to style up the header and the main content to kind of get them to look the way we want them to look. So header, I'm going to set the padding, background color, text align center, the color of the text in there, and then the margin on the bottom. So let's go ahead and do that. Header, padding, 50 px, background color, I'm using this cornflower blue. We're setting the color of the text to white, text align, center, and I put a margin on the bottom, margin bottom 20 px, and anything else that I did over here. Yeah, that's all good. All right, good. And then for main, we're going to have a max width of 800 pixels, padding 20 pixels, margin auto, that will center it on the page, display flex, that will make the two items in there sit next to each other, and justify content space between. And then we'll set sort of percentage width or specific width for those two items that are going to sit next to each other on the page there. So let's go ahead and add that in. Main, max width, 800 px. It's kind of a narrow page, but that's okay for what we're doing. Display flex. That turns it into a flex box. And I did some stuff with margin and padding. What did I do here? Padding 20 pixels, margin auto. Put that above, actually. It doesn't really matter, but padding 20 px, margin auto. There we go. And then with display flex, we'll do justify content space between, which will put a gap between those two items. The two items that are going to go next to each other are the form on the left and then this article on the right. Those become flex items. They're going to go next to each other, to sit next to each other in our design. So just like that, even with just those two rules, you'll see it's starting to come together a little bit there. Not very much yet, but it's starting to come together. Okay, great. We'll pick up the styling in the next video. Okay, so next we're going to set the width of the form and the article respectively. We'll add some margin back in the bottom of these elements so that they start to look a little bit better. And then the title is going to get text aligned to the center. So we'll be able to do all of that here. So let's go ahead and add that into our style sheet here. Main.form. We'll target the form itself. Width 40%. Setting it up a little bit to be responsive, but not entirely. Main article is going to be width 45%. So that adds up to 85%, which means that 15% will be left to be the gap between those two to create a little bit of a gutter between these two columns here. So we got that in, and then we can just put the margin on the bottom of these elements. H1, H2, H3, H4. If we have all of those, I think we might. Margin dash bottom 1M. You might be wondering, well, it seems kind of silly to take the margin out up above and then put it back in down below, but I found that I get a lot more control over the look of my pages and the visual spacing between things if these elements only have margin on the bottom and not margin on top and bottom, which is what they get by default in most browsers. Okay, so if we save that and check it over here, you can see it's starting to come together a little bit more. But the last thing I was going to do is center that title over there. So we've got pound title, text align, center. There we go. Let's see what else we need to do for styling. Got that going, so that's centered over there now. That's great. And then now we can, now we're just going to do a little bit with forms. And with forms, you could spend a lot of time designing forms and styling them. We're just going to do a little bit right now. What you should notice to begin with is that by default, form elements are inline or phrasing elements, and they'll go next to each other. And we don't really like that. We want it to kind of stack. So if you set them to display block and then work with them, they're a little bit easier to work with. Okay, so let's go ahead and add these rules in here. For the label, we're going to tell that to display block and put a little bit of margin on the bottom. Margin bottom 1M is fine. That's cool, so that'll work. And then for the other thing, we've got input, we've got the text area, and we've got this form. What did I have over here? I called it just the destination details form button. So this is just the button inside the form. And I'm being specific. because we might end up with another button later. Pound destination details form button. So that button, that specific button that's in over here. So that's this form, destination details form, and then this button down here. So I didn't put an ID on it. So being kind of specific there. And what we want to set is just display block width 100%, margin bottom 1M. I'm going to put a little bit of a border on it with a sort of medium gray and some padding and box sizing border box. So let's do that. Display block. That will make each one take its own line. What was it again now? I clicked the wrong one. Width 100%, margin bottom 1M. Margin dash bottom 1M. We've got that. Border 1px solid pound 666. Padding 10px. Box sizing border box. What box sizing border box does is it makes the padding and the border part of the width of the element. Remember, we set the width to 45%, so we don't want to extend beyond that size there. All right, cool. Let's take a look and see what that looks like over here. Well, that's looking much better, much cleaner. We will finish up the HTML in the next video. I mean the styling in the next video. We're going to add cards dynamically using JavaScript, but we want to know what they're going to look like. So the best way to do this is to add one manually, add a card that would get added by JavaScript with all the correct HTML, style that so we know what it's supposed to look like, and then remove that card. So that's what we'll do next. So we're going to start by going back and adding just a little bit more HTML. So we need a div with a class of card and an image with the signpost. And then in there, we're going to have the card body with an H3 and an H4 and a paragraph and a button. So we do have another button here. Okay, so let's go in and add this into our HTML over here. It's going to go down here inside this generated content by JavaScript here. We're going to do div class equals card. This has to be a class because we're going to have multiple cards, right? We're going to have multiple cards on the page, so you can only use an ID once, so that has to be a class. Then let's add an image. Images, signpost. I'm not going to put an alt tag on it at the moment. So we've got that image, and then we've got sort of the card body coming next. Div class card dash body. I don't know why that is slightly misaligned. That's right. Maybe it's this one that's slightly misaligned. There we go. Div class card body, and then inside the card body, we're going to add H3 destination name. And then we'll do an H4. Destination location. And then we're going to add a paragraph P with a class set to card text destination description. And then we're going to add a button that will allow you to remove the card if you need to. We'll have a feature that will allow you to take a card off. So we'll add that button in there. And I believe that's what we need for the HTML. Let's take a look over here. Yeah, there we go. All right, great. So we've got all of the HTML for that card in. It won't look particularly good. Let's see what it looks like. Doesn't look terrible, but it looks okay. But we might want to do a little bit more with it. Actually, it's fine for now. We'll leave it the way it is. We've got kind of our basic card in there. Although I do have a background color in there, don't I? Let's add that. Let's add one last rule down here for the card. I'm going to just give it a little bit of padding, set a background color, and set some margin on the bottom. And that should look good. Let's take a look at see how that goes. There we go. So now we've got a card. That's looking good. Ultimately, these are going to be put in through JavaScript. The HTML and CSS is in place now. And now that we've got that in place, we can start thinking about how this little application is going to work. Essentially, users going to type in a name and a location and provide a URL for a photo and a little bit of a description here. And then that will get added, that card will get added to the list over here. But let's take a look at a little bit of a flow chart to sort of see how this is going to work and how we're going to kind of make that all work out here. So over here on the right side of this page, you see we have a little program here that when it starts, when somebody fills out that form, we're going to prevent the default form submission. We're going to get the value from that destination name, the location field, the photo field, the description field, and then we're going to clear out the fields on the form, create a card, create that HTML, and check to see is the destination list empty? Is the destination list empty? If it is, then we're going to change the title on the destination list up at the top. If it isn't, then we'll just append the card to the container. In either case, we'll append the card to the container, and we'll be able to move on from there. Okay, so that's going to be the basic strategy for how we add stuff to the page. So the first time we add something to the page, this title is going to get changed, but otherwise it's not. So that's the only thing that's kind of going on there that's interesting. These are going to be little helper functions. Clear out the fields, and then we're going to have a helper function that's going to create the actual card. So those are the next functions we need to look at here. The creating the card looks like a really long function, but it's very sequential. And basically, we're just going to create a div and set the class to card, create an image tag, set the alt attribute on the image tag, and then if the photo is provided, we're going to set that source to whatever the URL is. If it isn't, we'll use the default photo, and then assign that image to the image element on the DOM that we just created. And then we'll create a div element. So basically, we're creating the elements manually or having JavaScript create them to create these elements here. We're creating all of this HTML here. For each card, we're going to create that information, and then we're going to stick it on the card. And that's what's going on here. And you'll notice down here we've got another helper function here for deleting the card. So if somebody clicks that remove button, then we need to be able to handle that as well. So let's take a look at that really quickly. So we've got a function here for going through the form fields and emptying out the form fields. And then we've got a little function here for deleting the card if we want to delete the card. So we've got a number of pieces here to write in our JavaScript to create this little application, this little functionality for this destination list. And that's it for part one. We've created the interface that we're going to be using. And you may be wondering why we spent all this time in HTML and CSS. But it's really important to understand how the HTML and the CSS interact with the JavaScript, because all three come together to make the full interface and to make all the functionality work. So I think it's worth taking the time to build the HTML and the CSS for this project so you understand what's going on and how the JavaScript is going to manipulate that HTML and CSS in the end to make the final product.